So today we have Ron Gordon with us. Ron Gordon, who's the Executive Director for the Commission on Criminal Justice and Juvenile Justice for the state of Utah. And he was appointed to that position by Governor Huntsman in February of 2009. And he oversees a 21-member commission charged with coordinating criminal and juvenile justice policy throughout Utah. He works closely with the executive branch agencies, the legislature, the judiciary, and local governments, as well as private providers in policy development. And he's also serves on the governor's senior staff as an advisor on criminal justice policy. Previously, Gordon served as the director of the Office of Crime Victim Reparations, coordinator of the Criminal Justice Advisory Council in Salt Lake County, director of the Utah Sentencing Commission, and staff attorney to the Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice. So he's had an interesting career with lots of fascinating sounding jobs in criminal justice area. He received a BS from Brigham Young University and a JD from the University of Utah. And his greatest joys and rewards in life are found in spending time with his wife and their 3 children. So let's welcome today with us Ron Gordon. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. I appreciate the opportunity. We don't have a remote, do we?
I guess not.
I can just come back to it when I need to
is that okay?
advance it. Oh, that's fine. Can everybody hear me?
Have we've
Okay.
had remotes in the past, but sometimes they're a little,
Okay,
right.
then I can
So,
hit the machine. That's pretty easy to do.
We'll just
That's great. That's great. I'm Ron Gordon. I work for the Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice, and I've been there since February of 1997, with the exception of about a 9-month stint, some hard time I did in Salt Lake County. I'll talk about that a little bit later as I get going today. I'm going to talk about my industry. My industry is a little bit different from most. I work in the industry of criminal justice policy. You don't go to any building and find the industry of criminal justice policy. You don't have one central headquarters for criminal justice policy. Instead, what you find are stakeholders in the criminal justice system who are concerned about policy, criminal justice policy and juvenile justice policy. Let me just throw them up here, and we can talk about them. So this is an example of the stakeholders in policy development in the criminal justice system and juvenile justice system. You have elected officials at state level, county level, city level. That might be the governor. It might be state legislators. It might be members of a city council or a county commission. All have something to do with criminal justice policy because crime is on the minds of everybody. Everybody who's running for office has something to say about criminal justice policy. Law enforcement, same thing, state law enforcement, county law enforcement, municipal law enforcement, even some federal law enforcement, even though our systems are quite different, functionally separate from federal. We have to combine because the systems do overlap at times. Prosecutors, defense lawyers, judges are all concerned because the policy that we develop impacts them directly. By the way, I should say, as I'm going along here, you have questions, just interrupt me. I prefer that than we have to wait till the very end. It's better for me to answer them right when you have them. So the policies we develop have a direct impact on the daily work of the prosecutors and defense lawyers and judges. It is exactly what they do. Government department heads, we work with them a lot. A lot of state agency department heads. To a lesser extent, county and municipal, primarily state government. Direct service providers are involved in criminal justice policy because we don't do it all as government folk. We have to rely on the private sector to deliver the direct services. And then private citizens have a lot of input from private citizens that goes into development of criminal justice policy because like elected officials, most people who are going to the voting booths and voting for somebody have something to say about criminal justice policy. A lot of people have either been the victim of a crime or have a family member or a friend who's been the victim of a crime. So everybody has something to say about criminal justice policy. So what is it we do? Well, this is, I know, kind of a silly slide, but elected officials, they do official stuff. Law enforcement, they enforce laws. Prosecutors prosecute. Defense, judges, everybody just does what their name says. Other citizens. I went with the keep us on track because that's kind of the nicest way to say that some of the interaction we have with other citizens. And I have to put other citizens in front of that. I have somebody who works in my office who takes great offense when we're characterizing all these different people and then just put citizens as though to suggest that the law enforcement and prosecutors and judges are not citizens. So other citizens is how we'll talk about that. What is it we do? And what's the point of all this? Well, here's the point. All those people that I just mentioned have day jobs that keep them really busy. And they don't have time by themselves to coordinate criminal justice policy, even though the policies, the laws that we enact, the administrative rules that we enact, the policies that come out of my office that govern grants and things like that I'll talk about here in a little bit, governs what they do every single day and all day. They don't have time to stop and think about it because they're doing what they do all day and every day. Let me get up the various disciplines, they just don't provide natural opportunities for people to get together and coordinate policy. You know, judges interact with the prosecutors and the defense lawyers in the courtroom. Judges interact with them through their pleadings. Judges aren't allowed to sit down with them over lunch and talk about a particular case or what could make the system better. So there just aren't a lot of opportunities for interaction. Policy, and this is kind of standard stuff here, policy is a lot better when it's discussed and coordinated. If you observe the legislative process in this state, you see examples both ways. You see policy that has been thoroughly vetted with all interested groups, and you see policy that one person thought, now this is a great idea, and I'm going to make a law out of this. Or one person, one legislator got a call from one constituent who said, you know, there ought to be a law about this. And they draft it and they run it through, and it's chaos because it hasn't been discussed and it hasn't been coordinated. All the different entities involved haven't had a chance to share their thoughts on it. So because of all those things, legislative bodies create entities like the Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice, that's my office, CCJJ is what we call ourselves, to discuss and to coordinate policy. And then the last little bullet point here is just to mention that there are a few people fortunate enough to have this as their entire day job, and I'm one of those individuals. I don't really have to live in the real world. I get to live in the policy-making world. So everybody else is doing their full-time job, dealing with the policies that we come up with, and I'm one of the few that have the chance to do it on a full-time basis. Okay, just a few things about how some folks got to this position. I have a legal background. It's not required for all criminal justice policy making, but it's helpful in a lot, and it's common in a lot of the positions that you'll find. I put an interest in policy, and I want to talk about this for a minute, and if you have just comments about any of these things, share them. Policy is different from partisan politics. So maybe I can get a little discussion going here and just ask some of you to share your thoughts about how policy is different or can be different from partisan politics. This is the part of the program where you speak back. Yes?
Well, partisan politics is all about, oh, we should do this or we should do that or whatnot. Whereas, as I understand it, what you do is more of once they say we should do this, you figure out how to implement it.
Good, thank you.
And as opposed to necessarily coming up with the big idea and bickering back and forth about, you take a proposed policy from the legislature or a law from the legislature and then decide if it's functional and feasible and then how to implement it. Whereas, so you don't necessarily fight with them, oh, this is a stupid law, unless it's completely infeasible and impossible to implement.
Thank you. We do a little bit of both. There's a lot of after-the-fact implementation, and that is policy development and policy refinement like you're talking about. Now, my agency actually does come up with the policies and take them to the legislature and say, we think that you should do this, or we see bills that they have proposed and we say, here's a problem we have with this. But you're right that there are at least two different kinds of policy. It's the development of the law, the articulation of the law, and then the practice, putting it into practice and making sure that works. There was another hand over here. Okay, great. Other thoughts? Please.
It just came to me that in partisan politics, a lot of times they're more interested in who's right or who's wrong, where for your job description, you're probably more interested in what is right or wrong, regardless of which party proposed it and how it will impact disparate parties. You're worried about a more broad focus, I guess, as it affects all the citizens.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. Any other thoughts? Okay, both comments very good and very accurate. There's a place for partisan politics, and that's the system that we have, and we recognize that, and we are part of that insofar as we work with the elected officials, whether it's a partisan election or a municipal, which would be a nonpartisan. And partisan politics, as you mentioned, usually end up dividing into two camps because we have two major political parties. And it's usually about what advances the aims of the party. When we get together, we like to say, check your partisan affiliation at the door because it doesn't much matter here. We can't spend our time talking about who is right or what party or what group is right. What we have to do is figure out what's in the best interest of the state of Utah.
Are you required to not participate in party politics? You know, not endorse candidates?
Am I personally?
People in criminal justice policy.
There are a few, particularly those who are legislative staffers. Some of the legislative staffers have requirements about how actively they can participate in partisan politics. Legislative staffers are staff to both parties. Minority and majority parties don't have separate staff. And so that means that those individuals do not participate in partisan campaigns. I personally am, it's kind of delicate. Am I allowed to participate? Absolutely I am. My boss is the governor of the state of Utah. So I am allowed to participate in partisan campaigns. Am I ever going to participate in a campaign where somebody's running against my boss or something like that? No, I'm not going to do that. So practically speaking, I don't get very involved outside of the gubernatorial election. Now, my wife is very active in party politics, and she supports candidates, and she campaigns for candidates, and she manages campaigns, and we make it work so that I can maintain my job and she can do hers. So there's no absolute prohibition for me. I just kind of have to be aware of who my boss is and who I work for. So like I say, we are interested in the question, what is best for the state of Utah? Now let me give you one example about this, and then I can move on. This happens not only within the state when we're talking about Democrats versus Republicans, it also happens when we're dealing with laws that might come from the federal government. So the federal government passes all kinds of laws that impact everybody in this country, and sometimes they pass laws that are a little bit outside of their direct scope. And the way that they get the states to comply is to say, you have received some money from us in the form of a grant. My office receives the Justice Assistance Grant. We receive like 5 or 6 grants from the federal government. One of them is the Justice Assistance Grant. The federal government will tie policy that they want states to enact to the grants that the states receive. And they'll say, you still get the grant, but here's a law that we think is fantastic and every state should enact. And if you do it, you get to keep that grant that you already have. And if you don't do it, we're going to take some of that money away from you. It's a threat. And it's a fairly effective threat because everything is governed by money when you're in the policy world and have to implement, as you were saying. It takes money to implement most policies. We've had to decide as a commission and an office that we will not approach things from that perspective. Our question is, what's in the best interest of the state of Utah? The big one right now that's facing us has to do with sex offender registries. Y'all familiar with sex offender registries. The idea is that the public should know who is out there committing sex crimes. And so the state, and every state in the country is this way, requires people who have been convicted of certain sex crimes to be on a public registry. So if you go to the Utah Department of Corrections website, you can type in your zip code and you can find out who all the registered sex offenders are who live in your zip code. It'll bring up their picture and the offense they were convicted of, when they were convicted, the statute when they were convicted, their primary targets, if they target children, teenagers, male, female, all that kind of stuff. The federal government wants a comprehensive federal sex offender registry. And so they say, states, here are the 1 million things we want to see in your registry, and you don't have to do it, but if you don't, we're going to take money away from you. That's, in our opinion, partisan politics. That is the federal government saying, here's what our party thinks, the party that wins the day on the vote, thinks is in the best interest. And my commission has said that's not how we're going to approach it. What we're going to say is on each one of these elements that the federal government has said we should have in our state law, does it work for the state of Utah? We're right now in the process of responding to the federal government's finding that we are not compliant with the federal regulations on sex offender registries and will likely lose some of our federal grant money. We are saying we disagree, but in the end we don't care. We're not really saying that because we don't want them to. We'd rather not lose the money. But what we're saying is we disagree with your finding, but we will not make any of these changes solely to come into compliance. And the analogy there is it doesn't matter what one party thinks. We're going to start with the same question always: what's in the best interest of the state of Utah? And that's a little bit different than partisan politics, where usually the starting point is the party platform, right? And there's a set of principles articulated in a party platform, and that's usually the starting point. And sometimes the starting point is just getting a good jab in at the other party as well. Research background is another common starting point, because I'll talk about this in a little bit. A lot of what we do involves research. There's some legal research and some policy research, and I'll go into more depth on that. Written and oral communication skills are big. We make presentations to everybody. We talk to legislators. We testify in committee hearings. We go out and talk with city councils and with county commissioners. We go and appear before the Chiefs Association, the Sheriff's Association, the Board of District Court Judges to explain to them what we are thinking, to get input from them. And this involves a lot of written and oral communication skills. Now here's one. This is really just kind of a placeholder so I can tell you one of the ways that I got into this field, and this is unique to me, I suppose. I graduated from BYU in 1995, and at the commencement exercises, then President Rex Lee encouraged everybody to consider public service. And my honest response in my head was, well, all these other suckers here can consider public service. I'm going to law school so that I can become rich and famous. And that's what I did. And that's all the thought that I gave to it. After my first year in law school, I clerked for a firm downtown Salt Lake City, Duke, Crockett, Bendinger, and Peterson, and it was good work. It was a great experience for a first-year law student. And they paid well. I was telling Kelly beforehand, it would take me a few years as a practicing lawyer before I ever made as much as I did clerking for that firm. And I hated it. I hated everything about it. So I decided I need another experience that's a lot different from the experience I just had. And I started thinking, maybe I've made a tragic mistake. I don't know what to do here. I'm 1 year into my 3-year law school. This is what I'm banking on. What am I going to do? And I started remembering the advice of Rex Lee. Give public service some consideration. So I did. I found an ad for a law clerk with the Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice. I was hired in February of 1997, and now I'm here talking with you. Okay, let's talk about some of my employment experience. I'm going to give you a little bit more detail about who we are. I'll just go ahead and get all these up here. There are really two different ways that you'll hear CCJJ discussed. It was created in 1983 by the legislature. Two definitions. One is as an umbrella agency. So there are a lot of other components, a lot of other smaller agencies that are housed within CCJJ for administrative support. We do similar things. We all coordinate some type of policy. That's us, CCJJ. The Utah Sentencing Commission has a little bit more narrow focus just on criminal and juvenile sentencing. Utah Substance Abuse Advisory Council, which, as the name suggests, talks about issues dealing with substance abuse, which is a big deal in the state of Utah. If you've been reading the papers recently, you've been seeing that Utah, unfortunately, leads the nation in prescription drug abuse and is high up there in deaths resulting from prescription drug overdoses. It's a big deal. Utah Board of Juvenile Justice and the Office for Victims of Crime. So there's a state agency located in the governor's office that is known as the Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice. And there's also this 21-member commission. The members of the commission are identified in state statute, and it's all those people that I mentioned early on. It's the judges, it's the prosecutors, it's the defense lawyers, it's the treatment providers, it's the citizens, all those folks, elected officials, are all members. It's the people who have a stake in criminal and juvenile justice policy. They serve for 4-year terms. They can be appointed once. Some of them are there by virtue of their job. So, for example, the executive director of the Department of Corrections is a member. And if that person is executive director for 20 years, then they'll be a member of my commission for 20 years. Although executive directors of corrections have a turnover about every 30 months is the national average. It's a pretty high turnover job. So if you're thinking about other jobs down the road, don't think about executive director of corrections until you're at the end of your career, because that's a pretty high turnover. I have really 2 roles in my job as executive director of CCJJ. One is to oversee all the operations of the office. So that's being staffed to the commission, implementing their policies or taking direction from them to go talk with the governor, with the legislature, with anybody else. And then the other, and it's the office and the personnel things as well. And I have a slide up here that I'll get into that in some detail. The other is to serve as a policy advisor to the governor on criminal justice issues. So if he has questions about criminal justice, juvenile justice, if he has a constituent that is asking a question about any of those things and is going to be meeting with that constituent, then I'll serve as the policy advisor. I will staff the meeting with the governor on that. He has assigned to me the responsibility of assisting him with judicial selection, and I think that does come up on a slide here, and I'll talk about that because for me that's a very interesting component of my job. Okay, what we do in my office, this is by statute. We evaluate criminal and juvenile justice policies, procedures, and programs. So the first comment that was made when I asked my question was focusing on the fact that we probably help coordinate policies after they've been passed, and that's what this one's talking about. This is after the fact, we evaluate what's going on in the state of Utah. You'll have various interventions. You'll have maybe a nonprofit organization that has a new approach to prisoner reentry. We want to make sure once somebody gets out of prison, they don't go back. And so a nonprofit will say, we have this fantastic approach to prisoner reentry. Or maybe somebody has a new program to treat offenders that have habitually been convicted of driving under the influence. Maybe there's a new program to treat people who've been convicted of domestic violence. What we do is look at those things and see if they're working. We have researchers on staff. We have a PhD researcher and a master's level researcher on staff. We also have contracts with universities in the state to help us do some of the research that we just can't do it all ourselves. But we will evaluate a program and see if in fact it's having the desired effect. See if this program that's being implemented by the nonprofit is actually reducing recidivism, reducing the rate that people return to prison if it's having no effect, or, unfortunately, sometimes we implement programs and they have the opposite of the desired effect and they increase recidivism. Maybe you've heard of drug courts. Everybody heard of drug courts and that idea? The idea is that some people commit crimes because of their substance abuse addictions, primarily because of their substance abuse addictions. And if we can treat the substance abuse addiction, then the criminality component goes away. So there are, in this state and most states, drug courts. And the idea is someone's been charged with a crime. Maybe it's forgery. They were forging checks so that they could get money and buy drugs. Theft, something like that, nonviolent crimes. They go to the court and they say, okay, I'm willing to plead guilty if I can enter into your drug court program. And in the drug court program, that guilty plea is set aside, and if they finish the drug court program, then the guilty plea is eliminated and they don't have a criminal record. And in that program, it's a very intense program. They're appearing before the judge initially every week. They're meeting with their probation officer and their treatment providers at least every week. It's intense therapy that's matched to their needs, and it's therapy that's targeted at their criminogenic needs as well. And the difference in the rates that people return to prison or commit crimes again is extraordinary when someone goes through one of these models. It's absolutely extraordinary. When you get the right person in drug court. Problem is, there was a time when people thought, this is the answer for everything. So everybody who's charged with a crime and we think they have a substance abuse problem, we're putting them in drug court. Drug court is great for people who have high substance abuse needs and high risk factors on our risk assessment. So the criminogenic risk factors are high and the substance abuse risk factors are high. That's the combination that says this person needs to be in drug court. What we found out through one of our evaluations is when we put people in drug court who have high risk factors in the substance abuse field, but very low risk factors in the criminogenic field, we make them worse. We expose them to other criminals who teach them to be better criminals. We get them habituated to being inside the court and being comfortable with it, and they commit more crimes than they would have before. The same actually is true of those who have very high criminogenic risk factors but low substance abuse factors. It's too much involvement. And so that's our job, is to study programs like that and see what does it work, why does it work, what factors are contributing to its success, and then we go back to the legislature and other policymakers and say, we think you ought to invest in this because it's good, but don't put the wrong people in. And not just the legislature, it's not just about getting money, it's about going to the courts and the prosecutors saying, don't put the wrong people in this program because you're going to make them worse. Boot camps were really popular for a while, juvenile justice intervention. They make all the kids worse.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Sorry. So what you're describing is fascinating, straightforward public policy style research, the sort that we teach in public policy programs like we have here. And it's not the sort that they teach as much in law school. So I'm curious about that. Do you have public policy people? I mean, is that a good route into this as well? Or am I wrong about that? You learn about this social science research in law school? Or?
No, this stuff in law school is viewed as like the other world, you know, the lesser world. We're not gonna mingle with those guys who deal with that social science stuff.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
But my field requires both. This is social science research. There's no question about it. It also involves legal research because we have to know what we legally can do. Drug court is a great example. We have to know, for example, when you go into drug court, is this person allowed to waive all of their constitutional rights? Because that's what we require. You go in, you say, I'm pleading guilty, and you can pull me back before the court anytime you want and send me to jail for 2 or 3 days at a time without actually revoking my probation. You don't do that in the criminal justice world. You have to revoke somebody's probation before you're going to send them back to jail. And you have to have reasons to revoke somebody's probation. They also say, you can come and search my home anytime you want. You can search my person anytime you want. You can search my car anytime you want. We don't do that in the criminal justice world. You need a search warrant to search somebody. So that's how the two fields kind of cross, is to say, that's a great idea, and we think from a social science perspective, it'll work. Is it legal? Is it constitutional? That's where the legal research and the social science meet.
Is most of your research just analysis, or do you actually like run experiments and randomly assign people to the drug course?
We do both. It's a little bit more difficult. A lot of it is after the fact research. A lot less random assignment. Institutional review boards really don't like us doing random assignments when we're talking about people and criminal justice and substance abuse. So most of it is after the fact. We're going to analyze how did these people do who went through drug court, and then we're going to look at their cohort who did not go to drug court but had similar characteristics, and then compare the two. Because of that, it means it takes a long time. It means the program's been in place for a year or two. You're going to start studying it. Then you got to look at recidivism factors for a couple of years. So these projects take a while. There are times when we get permission to do random assignments, and it's always kind of exciting when we get to do that.
I was going to say with the drug court thing, after what happened in Glenn County, Georgia, I don't know, you guys probably know about this, but with Judge Juvenile Williams, when a lot of her actions were being really critically looked at by a lot of the media, how do you guys respond to that? Do you do research of national drug courts? Because on the whole, it looks like they're really effective.
Yeah.
But sometimes.
Yeah, we do. One of the things that we do is to study policies that are going on in other states, because you can look at what's going on in Utah, but we like to see if there are new things going on in other states, and we want to make sure. Sometimes it's difficult to get the right effect size in the state of Utah, so we have to go outside the state and look nationwide. And this is the case even if we're not doing kind of controlled experiments or even program evaluations. Sometimes it's just to say, here's a law that we think is a good idea. What are other states doing with regard to this type of law? And we will, in that case, almost always go outside the state of Utah to see. Often we start with the surrounding western states and then kind of make our way east to see what other states are doing. But it's a pretty critical part of what we do. And what you'll find is if you're appearing before a legislative body and saying, here's a great new law that we think you should adopt, very few legislatures want to be the first to break ground on a controversial issue. And so they will say, well, what are our surrounding states doing? And so we've just learned you have to be prepared to answer that question. Other questions on that? Okay, here's what I do. I spend most of my time on legal and policy research, and I've explained that, I think. That'll be on Lexis, which is a legal search engine, and I'm looking at laws and statutes and case law in this state and other states to see, just get a sampling of what's out there and to get an idea of whether courts are upholding things. Again, if I go to the drug court example, just to get an idea, has it been challenged in other states? Has it been challenged for constitutional deficiencies? That's most of what I do, and that's the part that I love, is that legal research and that policy research. Working groups takes up probably more of my time than I would like, but it's necessary to get the work done. So this happens in two ways. Either I'm staffing a work group, so my 21-member commission says, we think that we need to study, this was a recent one that we had, we need to study civil commitment, particularly as it relates to sex offenders. Ron, form a study group and figure out what we ought to do with civil commitment of sex offenders. So we did that over the summer. We have a bill that will be coming out in the next legislative session that will deal with civil commitment of sex offenders. So that's one where I'm staffing it. I'm getting the group together. I'm leading the discussion, but not so much, I'm not a voting member of that type of group. And then they send me back to say, go do some more of this legal and policy research. What are other states doing? Are other states committing their sex offenders? And if so, what's the standard that they're using? and what are the courts saying about the way that they are civilly committing their sex offenders. And the other type of working group is when I'm invited because of my position to be involved on a group. I just went to the Forensic Mental Health Coordinating Council. I'm a member of that group by virtue of my position. It's exactly the same thing. It's just there. I'm a voting member, a participant, rather than the staff person. I mentioned judicial selection. In this state, the governor selects judges. I'll give you the process really quickly. I think it's fascinating, and I love this. And a year and a half ago, my office received a lot more responsibility for it. When there's a judicial vacancy, anybody who's interested submits their application. It used to go to the courts. Now those applications come to my office. My office oversees the judicial nominating commissions. The state has 8 judicial districts. There's one for each of those judicial districts, and then there's another one for the appellate courts. So if there's an opening, right now we're in the 4th judicial district. If there were an opening in the 4th district, then I would get the 4th district nominating commission together, 7 people who are appointed by the governor. There has to be political diversity. There can only be no more than 4 lawyers, no more than 4 people from any political party. And the courts, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court sends a representative of the judiciary who's not a voting member, participates fully in discussion, not a voting member. They look at all the applications, and let's say they get 30 or 40 applications. They will say, we want to interview the following 10 or 12 people. They come back, they interview 10 or 12 people, and then by statute they have to send 5 names to the governor, and the governor appoints somebody from that pool of 5 names. The idea is to have a merit-based selection process rather than a political selection process. So I staff all those processes. I staff the nominating commissions, and there I truly am staff. I'm running criminal background checks on people. I'm reviewing their credit to make sure that they're, and we look at these things. By the way, if you're ever interested in becoming a judge, know that I'm going to look at your credit score, and I'm going to see how many late payments you've had. I'm going to see if you've ever filed bankruptcy. I'm going to know everything about you.
You look at their Facebook pages?
I do. We look at Facebook pages. We look what they're tweeting. We look at everything. Now, most people who are applying for judges don't have particularly active Twitter accounts. Some do have Facebook pages. They're pretty mellow on their Facebook pages, but there's been a Twitter account that has come back to haunt more than one person in this field. Yeah?
When you give those 5 names to the governor, do you kind of give him a recommendation of who of those 5 you think? Or
We don't.
How does he go about?
We don't.
Does he have time to look into those 5 names?
That's where I come in. So the letter goes from the commission chair. Actually, it's kind of weird because when it was with the judiciary would write the letter to me, and now I essentially write the letter to myself, which is odd. But so I addressed it to the governor, but it's going to my office. But we say, the nominating commission has found that the following 5 people meet all the qualifications. The statute says they have to select the 5 most qualified candidates. And then the letter says they are listed in alphabetical order with no ranking of preference. So then the governor says, okay, Ron, you go through and read everything you can about these people. Go look at their Facebook page, go look at their Twitter account, look at their credit report and their criminal background, look at everything, call people, call judges, call other attorneys, find out everything you can find about them. And then I sit in an interview with them, with 2 other people in my office, and we conduct a preliminary interview, and then we go to an interview with the governor, and we are in the room with the governor, but the governor asks all of the questions. And then the governor will ask, after every single interview, he will say, okay, give me your ranking. And I'll tell you, the governor, his favorite joke, every single time we interview people, we interview the first one, and he always says, can we all agree they're in first place now? That's his standing joke, but that's what he does. And so we go through, and sometimes there's consensus on the first pick, and sometimes it's very clear who the first pick is. Sometimes there are 2 or 3, and the governor's not sure which one he wants to appoint, and he'll say, take the weekend, write up your pros and cons list on the top 3 candidates on every single one, and don't collaborate, don't work together, do it individually, and then we get together again and we talk about pros and cons, and then he makes an appointment, calls the person, and then tells me to call the 4 people who did not get the job. That's judicial selection. Constituent interaction, a lot of people are concerned about criminal justice. They're calling the governor, they're calling me, we interact with them through letter, we interact with them in person. Every once in a while, if they are concerned enough about an issue, we'll put them on one of these working groups, and we'll have them participate in coming up with solutions rather than just identifying some of the problems. I've mentioned legislator interaction. I deal with the typical stuff that any administrator deals with. I deal with personnel issues, and I deal with budget issues. Okay, I'll just mention this. Oh, let me go backwards here. I mentioned I started as a law clerk at Duke Crockett. I was a law clerk for CCJJ. Then I became staff attorney once I passed the bar exam. Now this is a little bit of an aside, but this is something that you'll find in the private sector or in the public sector. You're there as an intern, and you're thinking, this place is amazing. And you show up for this beautiful building, and you walk in, and this is what greets you when you walk in the office, and you think they love me, and I'm the greatest thing in the world. And then you get your full-time job as staff attorney, and do you realize that your office has a basement, and you have to walk through the boiler room to get to your new office, and they lead you to a desk that has been used as a storage compartment for the last 2 decades. Now, this is not an actual picture of my office, but it is pretty close to what my office looked like. So just be prepared. It's going to happen to some of you. You'll kind of feel like everything is fantastic, and then they're going to really put you through the ringer once you get into your full-time job. Okay, most of these I've mentioned. All of these, beginning with law clerk at CCJJ, all of them are with the same organization except the 9 months that I spent as director of the Criminal Justice Advisory Council. I decided that I needed to get a little bit of time in a local system because I'd spent all my time working in state government and thought it might be helpful to work at the county level or the city level. And so I took this opening, and it was actually a great job. I just really missed being at the state, and I missed that direct interaction that I had with the legislature. So I took that job, I think it was in March, and then in December, the deputy director of this office that I had left called me up and said, hey, we need a new director for crime victim reparations. You want to come back? And I said, sure. And now I'm the executive director. Okay, let me go through some of these things quickly. I know that this adage is out there and it's probably true, so I'll just proceed knowing that you can do whatever you want with what I say. Some of these things are going to sound pretty basic, but I was on the drive down here, I was thinking about the number of interviews I've been a part of. In the past 2.5 years alone, I've been part of over 300 job interviews. And I'm seeing the same stuff happen all the time. I'm going to start with these two. When you go into the interview, know something about the organization. I know that sounds very basic, but you'd be surprised how many people come into an interview not having done any research. And then that ties into the second one. It's not uncommon in an interview for someone to say to you, do you have any questions for us? Don't ever say, well, I don't know anything about your organization, so tell me about it. Or, I haven't really looked into the details of this job too much. Can you tell me what it is? That's terrible. I tune out immediately, and people do it all the time. Now, it's different if I say to you, do you have any questions? And you say, yeah, I was on your website last week, and I noticed something called legislative tracking, and it looks like positions or something you're taking on legislation. Tell me about that, because that seemed interesting to me. That's a question that shows me that you have initiative, and you're somebody that I want to hire. And I'll get to this. I had somewhere up here, I think. That's the type of question that tells me, regardless of other qualifications, I want you on my team. That book, Good to Great, talked about getting the right people on the bus. I want you on the bus, even if you're not the exact fit that I thought I wanted beforehand. So just do a little bit of research. Find out something about the organization, and don't ask for basic details when you're given that chance to ask questions. Okay. So I want you to make me believe that I need to hire you, but I don't want you to be obnoxious with me in the interview. You got to find a balance between confidence and humility. I had one person come in, and this was for a judicial interview, and The interviewee sat down. I had gone to get her and show her into the room. She sits down. I haven't even sat down yet, and this is a room, there's 8 people around the table. I haven't even taken my chair, and she says, well, let me tell you about myself, and we allocate 20 minutes for these first interviews, and we're all in stunned silence, and it's 12 or 13 minutes into it, and finally we interrupt and say, I'm sorry, we only allot 2 minutes for an opening statement, and we have a lot of questions we need to ask. No one in the room wanted to pay attention to anything else that she had to say, because there was this overconfidence of, I am taking charge of this interview. I'm going to tell you the way that I think you should take charge of the interview. Is anybody familiar with our appellate courts? You go to district courts where trials happen. The attorneys are in there and they have witnesses and they're questioning the witnesses. Judge makes a decision or the jury makes a decision, and then some party decides to appeal. So they go to either the Court of Appeals or they go to the Supreme Court. And what happens there is that the attorneys prepare a written brief and they submit it to the appellate court, and then they go before the court to present oral arguments. Here's the job of the attorney in the oral argument, and this is, I think, your job in an interview. The job of the attorney is to tell a story, is to tell their client's story to the judges. The problem is, if the attorney is lucky, they will get about a minute into their presentation before somebody on the Supreme Court starts asking questions. They interrupt and they ask questions. They've read the briefs, they think they know what you're going to say, and so they interrupt you. The key there is not thinking that you just sit back and respond to the questions. You have to be responsive to the questions that those judges are asking you. You have to be responsive to the questions that the interviewers are asking you, but you also have to make sure that you are telling your story. So you got to think on your feet and you got to be quick, but you never lose sight of the fact that you have a story to tell, and you're going to use their questions to tell your story. If the attorney in that oral argument only responded to questions, was only playing defense and never playing offense, the attorney would never get to say anything that he or she thought was important, because the judges, I mean, they're diving into these really obscure points of law, and sometimes they have nothing to do with what the attorney thinks are the key issues. So what do? You answer them, and then you steer them back to your point. You steer them back to your story. I just draw an analogy with interviewing. You go in with a story. You have to respond to their questions or you will not get hired. But you are not just simply playing defense. You have a story and you're going to use their questions to tell your story. And then kind of following along with that analogy, don't pass on the opportunity to make your closing argument. I always ask people, is there anything else you want to say? Is there anything we didn't ask you about that you want to make sure you tell us? Don't ever say no if you're given that chance. This is your closing argument. This is summarizing why you belong on the bus, why I should hire you. And I will tell you that there is at least one person that I've hired in my office who I hired solely because during the interview I thought, I can't do without this person. It's not the skill set that I thought I needed here. She has a fantastic skill set. I was a little bit worried that she was so overqualified she might become bored with the position that we were interviewing her for. But she did an amazing job of telling her story, and I thought she has to be on my team, and I'm going to take whatever risks come with hiring her. She's subsequently been reclassified, she's been promoted, raises, just because she is so key to our organization, but it's because she did such a good job of telling her story and of making her closing argument. Okay, a few things about, these are pretty basic too, I know. Succeeding in your career. I didn't have a slide that showed how I progressed through my organization because I think this one kind of gets to it. Look for new or exposure to new areas and accept new assignments. I know that sounds basic, but there are a lot of people who aren't willing to do this, to look for new areas in their job. The reason that I've been able to have different positions in my office and be promoted is primarily because of the first two. When I was director of the Office for Victims of Crime, somebody in the governor's general legal counsel called me and said, hey, can you help me on a records issue, a government records access management issue? We call it GRAMA. It's when people request records of the government. We have a duty to provide those records if they are public. It's a terrible area to get involved with because it's so messy, it takes so much time, it's so complicated, nobody likes to do it. But the fact that I did it and that she made me the expert in GRAMA for the governor's office, that's partly what led to me getting the job that I have right now, because when my predecessor left, she took me before the governor and said, this is the guy that I've been telling you about who's been helping us with GRAMA. And the governor said, oh, this is the guy who's been going through all those records requests. So that's been my experience, is being willing to look for new areas and accept new assignments has been critical. Make yourself indispensable by becoming an expert in something. When I was first hired, I was given the assignment, another sex offender registry assignment. These threats the government has been making, the federal government, have been going on since the mid-1990s and continue to today. And my boss walks into my office and hands me this enormous file with an enormous grin on his face and says, I want you to become the expert. Well, I didn't know what he was talking about. I didn't know it was like the hot potato file in the office that nobody wanted. It was terrible. It was a mess. It's been going on for years. We're still dealing with it. But it was good for me to become the expert in something. And so that's a great opportunity. Show initiative. Okay, so here's where I'm gonna get a little bit preachy here in the last couple minutes. This scripture in Alma 38:12, it works in missionary work, and it's key to your job as well. If you're right and you know you're right, then you should be able to be bold, and you should be able to tell people that you're bold or that you're right. But don't use overbearance. It's that same thing I mentioned in interviewing, with finding that delicate balance of confidence and humility. To be successful, you do need to use boldness, but not overbearance, and sometimes there's a fine line. Now, this isn't necessarily about succeeding. I just think it's a good practice. As you climb your ladder and as you're being successful, I would just invite you to identify ways that you can give other people opportunities to be successful. Give them meaningful assignments, and then let them run with it, and let them put their name at the bottom of the letter rather than you taking credit for it. Build the people around you. Build your office. Help make good people. I think it's critical to leadership in any field. I think it's critical to an educational system. I think it's critical to any work environment, is that you be willing to say, yeah, I have some authority, and maybe I'm the boss, but I'm going to share that with you, and I'm going to let you take the credit for the good work that you're doing. Okay, this is the last one, balancing act. There are more purposes than this, I'm sure, to your careers. I don't have any magic advice for you. I will just say to you, you need to think now about the priority. You're going to put these and whatever other purposes you might identify. Providing for yourself, families, is always important. When I was talking with my dad and talking about the field I wanted to go into, he said, I don't know that it much matters what you do, as long as you can serve your God and your fellow man in that. And by the way, that doesn't mean you have to limit yourself to something like, government or nonprofit work. Any occupation you can find, you should be able to identify ways to serve your God and to serve your fellow man. And I would suggest that has to be part of your equation. Opportunities for professional growth, always important. Solving the world's problems, of course, we all want to do it. But identify now the order of those things for you, because if you're going to let the job order them for you, it's going to end up being a much different list than what you'd come up with. Have 2 or 3 minutes. Any questions from anything I've presented today? Yes?
I often hear about kind of dismal prospects for future attorneys in the private sector. Can you talk about what it's like in the public sector for job opportunities?
Sure. The public sector is usually in a hiring mode for attorneys because there's a decent amount of turnover. Some people get into the public sector in prosecution or defense, and make it their life's work, and so they stay there forever. And others want to get a few years of very good courtroom experience that you can't get immediately in the private sector and then move on. So there are usually entry-level openings available. The climate right now is tough all around. It's tough in the public sector and it's tough in the private sector. Prosecution is one of the fields where you can usually find work, and public defenders is also an area where you can usually find work. And I will say public defenders get a bad rap sometimes. Defense attorneys in general get a bad rap. They're critical to our system. And if anybody is interested in exploring either field, I'd say explore both fields, explore both prosecution and defense. You can't be a good prosecutor or defense lawyer without being able to understand what the other side is going through, and both are critical to our constitutional form of criminal justice. There was another hand over here. Yes, please.
What kind of educational background do the people that you work with have as far as undergraduate, like master's degrees? What kind of fields are they coming from?
A lot of social science, and then a lot of masters in public administration. We have some MBAs on staff. We have a PhD researcher. There's someone in my office who has a master's of knowledge, which I would love to have someday. I'd love to be a master of knowledge. But a lot of them get into it because of their social science interest, although one in my office is an economics major. She's the one who's also the master of knowledge. So mostly social science, but because we have the research component, we have to have people unlike me who can crunch the numbers and do the hard research. I think that's probably it.
Well,
we're
thank
at
you
5
very
o'clock.
much.
You're welcome. You're welcome.